Long before penicillin revolutionized modern medicine, African ancestors were already fighting infections with astonishing precision, using nature's pharmacy. In ancient communities across the continent, knowledge wasn't just passed down, it was protected, revered, and refined. Herbal infusions, fermented grains, sacred rituals, these weren't random traditions. They were sophisticated responses to disease, centuries ahead of their time. And science is only now catching up. Recent archaeological discoveries have unearthed bones in Nubia, Sudan, dating back over 1,500 years, with traces of tetracycline, a powerful antibiotic. That's right. They were ingesting antibiotic compounds long before Alexander Fleming stumbled upon mold in a London lab. But how did they know? How did these societies, without modern instruments or scientific training, harness bacteria-killing agents from the earth? These questions remain largely unanswered. Not because there's no evidence, but because history was never on their side. African medical knowledge was written off, ignored, or labeled primitive. It was rarely documented, often dismissed, and almost never taught in the grand narrative of medical breakthroughs. Modern medicine tends to draw a sharp line between science and tradition. But in doing so, it erases centuries of innovation, particularly from cultures that didn't write their findings in Latin or store them in European libraries. While textbooks highlight Western pioneers, they barely whisper about the healers of Mali, the herbalists of Ethiopia, or the wisdom embedded in the soil of the Congo. And yet, there's a powerful irony. Today, as superbugs grow resistant to synthetic antibiotics, pharmaceutical companies are turning to the very traditions they once dismissed, scouring African flora for solutions our ancestors may have already discovered. The cycle has turned. What was once overlooked is now gold. This isn't folklore. It's pharmacology rediscovered. Behind every root and bark once deemed tribal lies a chemical legacy. Behind every healer's chant is a coded practice waiting to be decoded by science. And behind every attempt to erase these histories is a truth too resilient to die. This video is about correcting that story. We're diving deep into the astonishing truth that the roots of antibiotics don't start in a European lab, but in African soil. From fermented beers packed with medicinal bacteria, to the leaves and barks used by traditional healers, to recent scientific validations, this is a journey through a history deliberately forgotten and finally being rediscovered. Prepare to question everything you thought you knew about antibiotics, science, and where true knowledge really comes from. Long before microscopes revealed the world of bacteria, ancient Africans were already fighting invisible enemies and winning. In the arid plains of ancient Nubia, now part of modern-day Sudan, archaeologists made a shocking discovery. Human bones, dating back to the 4th century AD, saturated with tetracycline, a powerful antibiotic still used today. At first, scientists were baffled. How could a population that existed over 1,500 years ago have possibly come into contact with an advanced medical compound? The answer lay in their daily diet. Ancient Nubians brewed a type of beer using grain fermented with Streptomyces, a genus of bacteria that naturally produces tetracycline. Without knowing the molecular structure or conducting clinical trials, they had stumbled upon a process that delivered therapeutic antibiotics through regular consumption. This wasn't a lucky accident. It was refined knowledge passed down through generations. And Nubia was not an anomaly. Across West, Central, and East Africa, communities cultivated medicinal plants with antimicrobial properties long before modern pharmacology existed. Oral traditions, preserved by griots and healer families, described plants that killed evil within, or cleansed the blood. Today, we recognize those phrases as metaphorical references to bacterial infections and sepsis. The knowledge may not have been written in scientific terms, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Among the Hausa of northern Nigeria, the bark of certain trees was used to treat infected wounds and snake bites. In the Congo Basin, a thick paste made from specific roots was applied to boils and cuts, known locally to draw out sickness. These weren't just herbal folklore. Studies have since confirmed their antibacterial activity, showing inhibition against Staphylococcus aureus and E. coli, common pathogens responsible for skin and internal infections. In parts of Ghana and Senegal, traditional birth attendants administered crushed leaves with antiseptic properties to aid postpartum recovery and prevent infection. These methods, while simple, were rooted in systematic observation and trial, often with generations of evidence to back them up. The community didn't need microscopes. They had experience, memory, and results. What's even more remarkable is the system of knowledge transmission. Healers didn't rely on static texts, but on rigorous apprenticeships and observation. Remedies were adjusted for seasons, age groups, and symptoms, forming a kind of proto-clinical methodology that adapted with experience. The process was empirical, tested over lifetimes, refined through success and failure. It may not have resembled Western medicine, but it was its own science, deeply rooted, structured, and shockingly effective. Even burial practices hinted at antiseptic understanding. In parts of Ethiopia, herbs like myrrh and frankincense were used in burial rites, not just for fragrance but likely for their antimicrobial properties. Some researchers suspect this helped prevent the spread of infection in early towns, showing an awareness of hygiene centuries before the West embraced germ theory. These practices weren't driven by superstition, they were driven by results. Communities remembered what healed and forgot what didn't. Whether through brewing, boiling, drying, or grinding, Africans manipulated nature with intention. They weren't guessing, they were documenting with their hands, their rituals, and their memory. The implication is profound. African societies were not passive victims of disease, waiting for salvation from Western science. They were active innovators, experimenting, observing, and treating infections long before the word antibiotic even existed. This challenges not only the history of medicine, but the entire narrative of who gets to be called a scientist. Before hospitals, clinics, or pills, there were healers. Not in white coats, but wrapped in tradition and legacy. Across the African continent, traditional healers played pivotal roles in community health. Whether known as Ngangas, Babalawos, Sangomas, or Debusas, these individuals were not simply herbalists. They were pharmacists, therapists, midwives, epidemiologists rolled into one. Their knowledge was encyclopedic, built over centuries through trial, error, observation, and oral transmission. Healers didn't guess which plant to use, they knew. And that knowledge often aligned with what modern labs would later confirm. Take Prunus africana, for example, a tree native to the montane forests of Central and Southern Africa. Traditional healers used its bark to treat chest infections and fevers. Today, its extract is scientifically recognized for its antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties and has even been commercialized in treatments for prostate disorders. Then there's Artemisia afra, also known as African wormwood. Used by healers to treat malaria, colds, and digestive issues, this plant contains compounds with verified anti-malarial and antimicrobial effects. Its cousin, Artemisia annua, became the global standard for malaria treatment. But Africa's native Artemisia had long been doing the work in silence. Knowledge wasn't static. Healers adjusted treatments based on symptoms, seasons, and patient constitution. A child's cough might require steamed leaves, an elder's infection could call for fermented roots. These weren't random folk beliefs, they were nuanced therapeutic systems. And the respect they commanded wasn't just spiritual. In many villages, a healer's authority surpassed even that of chiefs. Women also played an essential role. From Ethiopia's midwives, who managed childbirth infections with antiseptic herbs, to Senegalese grandmothers who passed down recipes for wound poultices, women preserved and advanced medical knowledge, often excluded from formal narratives. Their contributions were vital and often the first line of defense in rural areas. The pharmacopoeia was rich. Caia senegalensis bark for skin infections, Vernonia amygdalina, bitter leaf, for typhoid and fevers, Ocimum gratissimum, African basil, for respiratory infections. These plants, used by countless generations, are now being studied in labs across the world for their antibiotic, antifungal, and antiviral effects. In Tanzania and Uganda, healer guilds maintain sacred groves of medicinal trees, each species tagged not by scientific names, but by its healing purpose. The land itself became a pharmacy, organized, sacred, and respected. Young apprentices were taught not just to use the plants, but to understand them deeply. When to harvest, how to prepare, and how to combine remedies for maximum effect. And while modern science demands proof in journals and petri dishes, traditional systems had their own validation. Community survival. If a remedy didn't work, it wasn't repeated. If it saved lives, it spread. And over generations, those remedies became central to the cultural and medical identity of entire regions. What's astonishing is the overlap. The same plants listed in pharmacological databases today were used in small clay pots over open fires centuries ago. The chemistry hasn't changed, only the language around it. Traditional African medicine wasn't alternative, it was empirical, localized science grounded in real-world outcomes. But recognition came slow. For centuries, Western medicine dismissed these healers as witch doctors, reducing complex therapeutic systems to superstition. Yet now, researchers in Europe, America, and Asia are combing through African herbariums for clues, many of which traditional healers had already cataloged with memory and wisdom. As the world begins to confront antibiotic resistance, the need for novel compounds is urgent. Ironically, some of the most promising leads are being pulled from the same leaves, roots, and barks healers have been using for generations. The plants never stopped working, we just stopped listening. For centuries, traditional African medicine was dismissed as myth. Now, it's guiding lab coats in some of the world's most advanced research facilities. As pharmaceutical companies race to find solutions for antibiotic-resistant superbugs, their path leads back to the very sources once ignored: indigenous knowledge and ancestral remedies. Plants long used by African healers are now at the center of cutting-edge biomedical research, and the results are forcing science to rewrite what it thought it knew. In South Africa, researchers at the University of Pretoria conducted extensive studies on Leonotis leonoris, also known as wild dagga. Traditionally used for fever, wounds, and infections, its extracts have shown strong antibacterial activity against common pathogens like E. coli and Staphylococcus aureus. These are the same bacteria responsible for everything from food poisoning to deadly sepsis, and this humble plant from ancestral gardens is combating them in clinical settings. Another study in Nigeria explored Vernonia amygdalina, bitter leaf, traditionally used to treat typhoid, fevers, and stomach ailments. In vitro analysis confirmed its effectiveness in inhibiting bacterial growth, aligning perfectly with generations of healer knowledge. What the elders knew through observation, the microscopes are now validating with data. One of the most transformative examples comes from Madagascar. Centella asiatica, used locally to treat wounds and skin conditions, is now a staple ingredient in dermatological creams worldwide, known for its antimicrobial and cell-regenerating properties. Western brands market it as go-to cola, rarely crediting its African or Asian origins, but its scientific rise was born in traditional practice. Scientists at the Kenya Medical Research Institute, KEMRI, are currently cataloging hundreds of indigenous plants with known antimicrobial effects. Their goal: build a comprehensive library of natural compounds for future pharmaceutical development. Early results show that many traditional remedies are not only effective, but rival synthetic drugs in potency, especially in cases where modern antibiotics are failing. What makes this validation remarkable is not just the outcomes, but the convergence of two knowledge systems. Western science demands peer-reviewed data and clinical trials. Traditional medicine relies on communal memory and outcomes. Now those two worlds are shaking hands, and the implications are enormous. Consider the case of Cryptolepis sanguinolenta, a climbing plant used in West Africa for treating malaria and bacterial infections. Recent studies have confirmed its effectiveness against Plasmodium falciparum, the parasite responsible for malaria, and also its action against gram-positive bacteria. Even more impressive, it showed no toxicity in controlled experiments, a key barrier for many synthetic drugs. But validation hasn't always led to recognition. Pharmaceutical companies have often patented drugs derived from indigenous plants without credit or compensation to the communities that preserved their use. This practice, sometimes called biopiracy, raises serious ethical questions. Who owns knowledge? And who gets to profit from it? In many cases, traditional healers provided the blueprint, but were never mentioned in the patents. The story of Hoodia gordonii, a succulent used by the San people of the Kalahari to suppress hunger, illustrates this imbalance. When a pharmaceutical firm attempted to commercialize it as a weight loss drug, it took global backlash before the San were acknowledged and offered a benefit-sharing agreement. It was a step forward, but one that came only after public pressure. This tension between discovery and exploitation underscores a deeper truth. Indigenous knowledge is not just data, it's intellectual heritage. Validating it scientifically should not mean divorcing it from its cultural roots. It should mean protecting it, funding it, and respecting it. Thankfully, new models are emerging. In countries like Ghana and Tanzania, partnerships between universities, traditional medicine practitioners, and biotech firms are creating ethical frameworks for research and commercialization. These projects aim to ensure local communities retain both recognition and benefit from their centuries of preservation and experimentation. The African Center of Excellence for Phytomedicine Research and Development is one such initiative, dedicated to transforming traditional remedies into scientifically verified medicines without erasing the origin stories. Through such centers, Africa is not just contributing plants, it's reclaiming the narrative. And there's more on the horizon. Machine learning is now being used to scan indigenous knowledge databases and predict which plants may hold the most promising pharmaceutical compounds. This fusion of AI and ancestral knowledge could lead to a renaissance in antibiotic discovery, led not by chemical factories alone, but by libraries of leaves, roots, and lived experience. As this research expands, one message becomes clear. The laboratory is no longer the only arena of truth. The forest, the field, and the healer's hands have always been data-rich environments. Only now, science is finally listening. If African societies had discovered antibiotic treatments centuries ago, why isn't this common knowledge? The answer isn't about science, it's about power. The colonial era did more than redraw maps, it rewrote truths. European colonizers systematically undermined African intellectual systems, labeling them primitive, superstitious, or unscientific. This wasn't incidental, it was strategic. Discrediting traditional medicine helped justify domination, cultural suppression, and the imposition of Western systems, including healthcare. Colonial administrators banned or restricted traditional healing in many regions, often criminalizing the practice. Healers were sometimes imprisoned, their herbs destroyed, their practices mocked. The intent was clear: dismantle local health systems to make way for imported medical structures. By removing traditional medicine from legitimacy, colonial powers positioned themselves as the sole bearers of real knowledge. This erasure seeped into education. African children were taught European history, biology, and chemistry, but never about the botanical genius of their grandmothers or the medical practices of their ancestors. Generations grew up believing their culture had contributed little to global science. The damage wasn't just historical, it was psychological. Even well-meaning Western researchers contributed to the silencing. In the early 20th century, anthropologists documented indigenous practices, but often dismissed them as ritualistic or symbolic rather than medicinal. Meanwhile, pharmaceutical interests quietly extracted knowledge from healers without attribution, mining the oral libraries of Africa while crediting discoveries to distant universities. This wasn't just colonial arrogance, it was epistemic violence. It erased data because it was spoken, not written. It dismissed clinical observations because they weren't run through microscopes. And it denied the title of scientist to anyone who didn't wear a lab coat, even if their methods were empirical, repeatable, and life-saving. The effects are still visible today. Many African governments have only recently begun to formally recognize traditional medicine in national health systems. Funding for research into indigenous pharmacology remains far behind what's allocated to Western-style hospitals and pharmaceutical imports. And most global histories of medicine still start in Greece or Britain, rarely mentioning Timbuktu, Ife, or Great Zimbabwe. The truth is, this knowledge was buried, not because it lacked value, but because it threatened dominant narratives. It disrupted the idea that progress only flows from the West. It challenged the myth that Africa was a land of problems, not solutions. And it revealed something inconvenient, that some of the most advanced medical practices didn't begin in a laboratory, but in a village. Yet despite suppression, the knowledge survived, in songs, proverbs, sacred groves, and coded rituals. It lived on in grandmothers' whispers and healer apprenticeships. It adapted, endured, and now it's rising again, demanding not just recognition, but restitution. After centuries of suppression, something powerful is happening. African medicine is coming home. Across the continent, scientists, herbalists, and cultural guardians are working to reclaim and revalidate indigenous medical knowledge. They're not just preserving tradition, they're advancing it. In Ghana, the Center for Plant Medicine Research collaborates directly with traditional practitioners, testing remedies for safety and efficacy. In Nigeria, ethnobotanists are creating digital archives of ancestral treatments before they're lost to time. This is not nostalgia, it's innovation rooted in respect. While the West searches for novel compounds, African researchers are turning to old ones with new eyes. The aim isn't to replace modern medicine, but to integrate, to create a truly African model of healthcare that combines the best of both worlds, laboratory precision and ancestral wisdom. In Rwanda and Kenya, national health policies now recognize and regulate traditional medicine. Certification programs for healers are being developed. Governments are investing in conservation of medicinal plants and establishing legal frameworks for bioprospecting that ensure communities benefit from discoveries sourced from their traditions. Young Africans are also leading the charge. Students in pharmacology, botany, and anthropology are rediscovering what was once dismissed. Instead of viewing tradition as outdated, they see it as data-rich, layered, and future-facing. From publishing peer-reviewed studies on indigenous antibiotics to launching herbal startups grounded in rigorous science, a new generation is rewriting the story, one root at a time. Digital tools are accelerating the movement. Platforms like the African Ethnomedicinal Database and local language audio archives are preserving oral traditions and turning scattered wisdom into searchable, shareable knowledge. What was once fragile and regional is becoming resilient and global, carried not just in memory, but in code. There's also a growing cultural pride in indigenous healing systems. Artists, filmmakers, and authors are celebrating healers as scientists. Documentaries highlight herbalists not as relics of the past, but as living libraries. Festivals are featuring plant-based healing traditions, drawing attention not only to their efficacy, but to their role in African identity and sovereignty. This resurgence is not without resistance. Some still see traditional medicine as incompatible with modernity. But the movement isn't asking for permission. It's building momentum. And with increasing awareness of the limitations of Western pharmaceuticals, from side effects to resistance, the world is beginning to listen again. What's being reclaimed isn't just healing techniques, it's ownership, intellectual sovereignty, cultural agency, the right to define health on African terms. This is more than integration, it's restoration, because for too long, Africa's contribution to global medicine was hidden, stolen, or ignored. But knowledge kept in the soil, in the leaves, in the stories, never dies. It waits. And today, it speaks louder than ever. The story of antibiotics doesn't begin in a lab. It begins in the soil, in the hands of healers, in the wisdom of those who listen to the earth. What we've uncovered isn't just a hidden history. It's a truth that repositions Africa not as a receiver of knowledge, but as its originator. Long before the term antibiotic was coined, long before penicillin entered the textbooks, African communities were mastering microbial warfare with leaves, roots, and fermented grain. Through ancestral ingenuity, they developed systems of healing that were empirical, complex, and effective. These systems weren't lesser forms of medicine. They were parallel sciences, shaped by generations of observation and refined by lived experience. Modern laboratories are now echoing what village healers already knew. The molecules that Western researchers seek in jungles and valleys are the same ones our ancestors administered beside riverbanks and under moonlight. The future of medicine may be synthetic, but its foundations are organic, indigenous, and deeply African. We've also learned why this story was buried. The erasure of African contributions wasn't accidental. It was part of a broader project to define who gets to be called a scientist, who gets to publish, and who gets to profit. But knowledge cannot be erased if it lives in people. And in Africa, it does. Today, a new chapter is being written. Not in opposition to modern medicine, but in dialogue with it. Healers and scientists, elders and researchers, working side by side to recover, validate, and expand what has always been ours. This is more than a movement. It's a reclamation. So next time you hear about a miracle drug or a new plant-based antibiotic, ask, where did this really come from? And who deserves to be remembered? Because the answer might just lie in the wisdom of a grandmother, the bark of a tree, or the quiet memory of a healer who never wore a lab coat but saved lives all the same. If this story opened your eyes like this video, subscribe for more and share it. Let the world know African medicine was never lost. It was just unheard. Until now.